What if the most powerful foods for health and survival were not invented by modern nutrition science, but were already being eaten thousands of years ago, long before grocery stores, supplements, and complicated diets? Entire civilizations thrived on simple foods that grew right outside their homes. Foods mentioned in ancient texts. Foods that could survive droughts, harsh climates, and even war. And here's the strange part. Many of these foods are still around today, but most people walk past them in the garden center without realizing what they are. Before we dive in, tell me something in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? And what's the #1 food you wish you could grow in your own garden? Because in this video, I'm going to show you something fascinating. You'll discover ancient biblical foods that are not only incredibly nutritious, but many of them are surprisingly easy to grow. Some produce harvests for years. Some thrive in poor soil, and a few can store for months or even years without refrigeration. In other words, they're the exact kinds of foods you'd want in a survival garden. But stick with me until the end, because one of the plants we'll talk about later is so resilient that it has sustained people in harsh desert regions for centuries. And it might be one of the most underrated survival foods on the planet. Now let's step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Because this story isn't really about ancient history. It's about the future of your food right now. Many people are starting to realize something their grandparents already knew. Modern food systems are incredibly convenient, but they're also fragile. Most grocery stores carry only a few days' worth of food supply. Prices rise quickly when crops fail. And many of the foods we rely on today require large industrial systems just to exist. But for most of human history, people didn't depend on that kind of system at all. They grew hardy crops. They stored food for winter, and they relied on plants that had proven themselves over generations. Some of those foods show up repeatedly in ancient writings, including the Bible, because they were essential to daily life. Take olive oil, for example. In the ancient Mediterranean world, olive trees were more than just crops. They were long-term investments. A healthy olive tree can produce fruit for decades, sometimes even centuries. Families would plant them knowing their children and grandchildren would benefit from the harvest. Or consider lentils. In ancient times, lentils were one of the most reliable foods people had. They store extremely well when dried. They're packed with protein and minerals, and they grow in relatively tough conditions where other crops struggle. There's even a famous story where someone trades his birthright for a bowl of lentil stew. That might sound strange today, but in a world where reliable food meant survival, a pot of nourishing stew was no small thing. And here's what's really interesting. Many of these ancient foods aren't difficult crops that require perfect conditions. Quite the opposite. They were valued because they were dependable. They could grow in poor soil. They could survive dry seasons. And they could feed families when other crops failed. In the next part, we'll start with one of the most famous foods in the ancient world, a plant so valuable. It was called liquid gold, and surprisingly, it might be one of the easiest long-term food sources you can add to your garden landscape. Let's start with one of the most famous foods in the ancient world, olives. In the Mediterranean, Olive trees weren't just crops. They were part of the landscape of life itself. Some olive trees are known to live hundreds of years, and a single mature tree can produce harvests season after season, with surprisingly little maintenance. That's one of the reasons ancient families planted them. You weren't planting just for this year's harvest. You were planting for decades of food. Olives themselves are not typically eaten straight off the tree because fresh olives are extremely bitter. They must be cured in salt water or brine before they become edible. But once processed, they become one of the most versatile foods you can store and use. And, of course, olives produce olive oil. Cold-pressed olive oil has been studied extensively in modern nutrition research, particularly in the Mediterranean diet. Many studies link diets rich in olive oil with improved heart health and reduced inflammation. But from a survival gardening perspective, what matters most is durability. Olive trees tolerate drought better than many fruit trees. They thrive in warm climates and poor soils where other crops might struggle. Once established, they require surprisingly little care. Of course, they don't grow everywhere. Colder climates may not support olive trees outdoors. If winters drop far below freezing, the trees may not survive. In those regions, people historically relied on other hardy foods. Which brings us to the next group of foods so simple that people sometimes overlook it today. Yet it fed soldiers, farmers, and entire communities for thousands of years. Lentils. If you wanted one food that could quietly sit in storage for years and still feed your family when times got difficult, lentils would be near the top of the list. Lentils are one of the oldest cultivated crops on Earth. Archaeologists have found evidence of lentil farming going back thousands of years across the Middle East and Mediterranean regions. And there's a reason they stuck around for so long. Lentils are incredibly practical. They grow relatively quickly. They tolerate porous soils better than many crops. And when dried properly, they can be stored for long periods without refrigeration. Nutritionally, lentils are impressive as well. They are rich in plant protein, fiber, iron, and several essential minerals. Because they digest slowly, they also provide steady energy rather than sudden spikes and crashes. Historically, lentils were cooked slowly into soups and stews, often with herbs and spices. The long cooking process made them easier to digest and improved the availability of certain nutrients. For gardeners today, lentils can be grown in moderate climates with a fairly simple setup. They prefer cool growing seasons and well-drained soil. The plants themselves stay relatively small, which means they can even fit into smaller garden spaces. But lentils weren't the only staple crop ancient families depended on. There was another humble food that appeared on tables across the ancient world. From simple village homes to the diets of traveling workers. A grain so reliable that it fed thousands in one of the most famous food stories in history. Barley. And in the next section, I'll show you why barley might actually be one of the most underrated survival grains you can grow. Now let's talk about a grain that quietly fed entire civilizations for thousands of years. Barley. Barley may not get the attention that wheat or rice gets today, but historically it was one of the most dependable grains people grew. It appeared across the Middle East, Europe, and parts of Asia because it had one major advantage. It was tough. Barley can tolerate colder weather better than many grains, and it can grow in soils that would struggle to support more demanding crops. For ancient farmers, that reliability mattered more than perfect taste or appearance. In fact, in one famous biblical story, where thousands of people were fed with a few loaves and fish, the bread mentioned was barley bread. That wasn't unusual at the time. Barley bread was considered everyday food for ordinary people. Modern nutrition research has also become interested in barley again because of a type of fiber. It contains called beta-glucan. This soluble fiber has been studied for its potential role in helping regulate blood sugar and supporting heart health. But from a self-sufficiency point of view, barley's real value is simple. It stores well once dried. Whole grains can remain usable for long periods if kept cool and dry. That's one of the reasons grains became the foundation of many traditional food systems. Growing barley today is still fairly straightforward in many climates. It prefers cooler temperatures and well-drained soil, and it doesn't usually demand as much fertilizer as other crops. But grains alone were never the whole story. Ancient diets almost always included fruits that provided quick energy, natural sugars, and important minerals. And one fruit in particular shows up again and again throughout history, especially in the Middle East. Dates. Imagine traveling through a hot desert landscape thousands of years ago. There are no convenience stores, no refrigeration, no packaged energy bars. Yet people still had portable food that could keep them alive during long journeys. That food was often dates. Date palms have been cultivated for thousands of years across North Africa and the Middle East. In fact, in many desert regions, date palms were considered one of the most important trees a community could have. A mature date palm can produce large harvests every year once it reaches full productivity. The fruit itself contains natural sugars like glucose and fructose, along with fiber, potassium, magnesium, and other minerals. Because dates dry naturally, they also store extremely well. This made them ideal travel food. Traders, soldiers, and pilgrims could carry dates for long distances without worrying about spoilage. In some cultures, eating a few dates is still the traditional way to break a fast because they provide quick energy while still being gentle on the stomach. Growing date palms does require the right climate. They thrive in hot, dry regions and generally need warm temperatures for proper fruit production. In colder climates, date palms are more difficult to grow outdoors, but the idea behind them is important. People throughout history relied on plants that could produce large amounts of calorie-dense food with relatively little yearly effort once established. And that idea leads us directly to another ancient fruit that appears throughout history and tradition. A fruit so visually striking that it became a symbol of abundance in ancient cultures: pomegranates. Now let's move to one of the most beautiful fruits in the ancient world, the pomegranate. If you've ever opened a pomegranate, you know it feels almost like discovering treasure. Inside that tough outer skin are hundreds of jewel-like seeds, each filled with bright juice. In many ancient cultures, this fruit became a symbol of abundance and life. That probably wasn't just symbolism. A single fruit contains hundreds of edible seeds, which made it a powerful image of fertility and prosperity. but the practical value mattered just as much. Pomegranate trees are surprisingly resilient. They can tolerate drought once established and can grow in areas where some fruit trees struggle. They also handle heat well, which is one reason they became common across the Middle East and Mediterranean. From a nutrition perspective, modern research has become very interested in pomegranates because they contain a wide range of polyphenols and antioxidants. Some studies suggest these compounds may help reduce inflammation and support cardiovascular health. But what really made pomegranates valuable historically was how versatile they were. People ate the seeds fresh, pressed the juice for drinks, and even dried parts of the fruit for later use. In some traditional systems of medicine, the rind was used in herbal preparations for digestive issues, though anyone considering medicinal uses should consult knowledgeable professionals. For gardeners, pomegranates are also attractive plants. They grow as small trees or large shrubs and produce bright red flowers before the fruit forms. And once established, they often require less water than many other fruit crops. But not every important plant from ancient diets was a fruit or grain. Some were humble herbs, plants that people grew in small kitchen gardens right outside their homes. And one of those herbs might surprise you, because it appears in ancient purification rituals and historical writings. Hyssop is one of those plants that many people have heard mentioned but few have actually seen growing. It's a small aromatic herb with narrow leaves and spikes of purple or blue flowers. In warm climates, it can behave almost like a perennial, meaning it returns year after year. Historically, hyssop appears in ancient texts associated with purification practices. For centuries, it was used as a symbolic cleansing herb in rituals and ceremonies. But interestingly, modern researchers studying aromatic herbs have found that plants related to hyssop contain natural compounds also present in herbs like thyme and oregano. These compounds are known to have antimicrobial properties in laboratory studies. That doesn't mean hyssop should be treated as a medical cure. Herbs can interact with medications or cause reactions in some people, so medicinal use should always be approached carefully and ideally under professional guidance. However, from a gardening perspective, hyssop has several benefits. It's relatively easy to grow. It tolerates dry conditions once established. And its flowers attract pollinators like bees and butterflies, which helps the rest of your garden. This is one of those plants that ancient households likely valued not just for symbolism, but because it served multiple purposes at once: culinary, aromatic, and cultural. And that idea, plants that serve many roles, shows up again and again in traditional gardens. But the next food on our list might be one of the most famous kitchen ingredients in history. In fact, there's a moment in ancient stories where people complained loudly because they missed it so much. They missed garlic. And in the next section, you'll see why garlic might actually be one of the most powerful and easiest crops you can grow in your own garden. Now let's talk about a plant so common in kitchens today that many people forget how valuable it has been throughout history. Garlic. In ancient writings, there's a moment where people wandering in the wilderness remember the foods they used to eat and complain because they miss them. Among the foods they long for garlic is specifically mentioned. That might sound surprising until you realize just how important garlic has been across cultures for thousands of years. Garlic is one of the most widely studied culinary plants in modern nutrition science. When garlic is crushed or chopped, it forms a compound called allicin. Researchers have studied this compound for its antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties in laboratory settings. Many studies have also explored garlic's potential role in supporting heart health, blood pressure regulation, and immune function. While garlic isn't a miracle cure for anything, the evidence suggests it can be a valuable part of a balanced diet. But from a gardener's perspective, garlic has another major advantage: it's incredibly easy to grow. Garlic is usually planted in the fall in many climates. Each clove becomes a full bulb the following summer. It doesn't require complex care, and it doesn't need large garden beds. Even a small garden can produce a surprising amount of garlic. Another benefit is storage. Once harvested and properly cured, garlic bulbs can last for months, sometimes much longer, if kept in a cool, dry place. That makes it exactly the kind of crop ancient households depended on: reliable, nutritious, and useful in almost every meal. But if garlic was the flavor of ancient kitchens, there was another plant right beside it nearly every day: onions. Onions may be one of the most quietly powerful foods in the traditional kitchen. For thousands of years, onions have been used in nearly every cuisine across the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Archaeologists have even found evidence that ancient workers were fed onions regularly as part of their diet. Why? Because onions store well, grow fairly easily, and add flavor and nutrition to almost any dish. Modern research has shown that onions contain compounds such as quercetin and various sulfur-containing molecules. These compounds are being studied for their potential antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects. Onions also contain a type of fiber called inulin, which acts as a prebiotic. Prebiotics help feed beneficial bacteria in the gut, which is one reason many traditional diets rich in vegetables, herbs, and legumes supported digestive health. From a gardening perspective, onions are extremely practical. They grow in many climates. They don't require a huge amount of space. And once harvested and cured properly, they can be stored for months without refrigeration. But before we finish, remember the survival food I mentioned near the beginning, the one that helped sustain people in harsh environments. That plant is the carob tree. Carob produces long brown pods that contain naturally sweet pulp. Historically, these pods were sometimes called locust beans, and some scholars believe references to locusts eaten in the wilderness may refer to these pods rather than insects, though interpretations vary. Carob pods contain natural sugars, fiber, and minerals, and they store extremely well once dried. In some regions, they were ground into flour, boiled into syrup, or eaten directly as a sweet survival food. The tree itself is extremely drought-tolerant once established, which is why it has survived for centuries in Mediterranean climates. And that brings us to the bigger lesson behind everything we talked about today. The people of the ancient world didn't rely on fragile food systems. They relied on hardy plants, crops that could survive drought, crops that stored well, crops that could feed families year after year. If you forget everything else from this video, remember this simple idea. Build your garden around resilient foods. Plant long-lasting trees. Grow crops that store well. And choose plants that your future self, maybe with less time and a sore back, can still manage easily. You don't need to grow everything at once. Just start with one or two. Maybe garlic this fall. Maybe lentils or barley next season. Small steps like that are how real food security begins. Now I'd love to hear from you. Which of these ancient foods would you want to grow first? Tell me in the comments, and also tell me what country you're watching from. I read every single comment. And if you want more videos like this about forgotten survival crops, ancient garden wisdom, and plants that feed families for generations, make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. Next, I'm thinking about making a video on 10 edible weeds hiding in your backyard that people used during famine. If you'd like to see that, comment weeds, and I'll see you in the next video.